a special night in several ways. The first is that this is the first of what we want to call the Ned Ames Honorary Lectures. Ned being a very important person for the Carey Institute by virtue of guiding the Mary Flagler Carey Charitable Trust for many years, which, of course, or from which we were an enormous beneficiary. I first met Ned in 1970 when I was a college kid working at Tilton School in the summer program. He was working at the Ford Foundation at the time. He funded the program that had supplied my summer job. I didn't forget that connection. But it was a number of years, probably 20, 25, maybe even 30 years, before I ran into Ned again, which was at a board meeting of the Southern Environmental Law Center when he that in itself, maybe something was expected of me for the next 20 or 30 years, but Ned talked me out of it. There's a much better option in Millbrook. Ned, over the years, particularly with the running of the Mary Flagler Carey Charitable Trust, funded so many things in culture. I've always thought that Ned was one that could make the right decision for the long term at the right time, and valued it and wished his legacy with that kind of wisdom to carry on. So we're going to have a lecture in the spring every year known as the Ned Ames Honorary Lecture. I guess technically it's the Edward A. Ames Honor, but nobody knows him by that. Ned Ames, who sits over here in the audience. Ned, could you stand up and take a little while? I should add that he was a longtime trustee of the Carey Institute as well, and we certainly welcome all of the work that he did in the Board of Trustees for those many years. Now, we have two major events tonight. The first is looking at the future of environmental science, and I want to award, as we do annually, the award for the best project in environmental sciences and ecology at the Dutchess County Regional Science Fair. We take seriously here, even though we don't ostensibly appear to be an institution that trains students at institutions of higher education, we take seriously what we do with students at all ages, K through 12, with our outreach programs to local schools, and participation in science fairs, undergraduates that come here in the summer from colleges across the nation in the Research Experience for Undergraduates program, and our programs for graduate students and doctoral students. But tonight, Jack Bomar is our awardee for the best project in environmental sciences and ecology at the Dutchess County Regional Science Fair. He's in the 6th grade at Dutchess Day School. Let me read what the committee said about his project, which can be seen outside on a table. If you didn't see it on the way in, you can see it on the way out. The title is, "What is the best biofuel?" And here's the quote, Jack investigated the quantity of ethanol derived from various starting stock materials with different levels of starch. He included an acid hydrolysis step in the treatment, distilled the mixture to determine the quantity of ethanol produced, and combusted it to ensure that the liquid was ethanol. He considered the economics of biofuel combustion production by calculating the amount of ethanol produced one of the spots on the horizon that policymakers are considering and in many cases taking seriously as a solution to our nation's energy problems, if not the world's. And Jack, if you'd come up, we have a certificate here. We also have a check. That's probably more interesting. Our second course of business for the evening, of course, is the lecture that Tom Lovejoy is about to give. Now, Tom is a name and figure of just immense stature in the world of environmental science. He got his, he began his career at Millbrook School here, so he has a real connection to this area. I don't know whether we're going to do the Millbrook School song or whatever tonight, but maybe we can pass on that. Went from here to Yale, where he got both his undergraduate and doctoral degrees. Along the course of his career, he coined the term biological diversity, which has been truncated to biodiversity, which appears in so many texts, and it's even the titles of books now. He was instrumental in developing what is known as the debt for nature swaps that allowed a lot of countries in the developing world to essentially swap their debt that they'd accumulated with the promise of preserving nature within their boundaries. Tom has held a variety of positions at the World Wildlife Fund, the Smithsonian Institution. We shared a common experience on a strange committee called Medea that the federal government had to look at classified images as they might be used for environmental science. He, for a number of years, was president of the Heinz Foundation, or Heinz Center for Environment in Washington, and now holds the Heinz Chair in Biodiversity in that organization. Tom has, from the very earliest stages of his career, thought boldly. I was on an NSF panel longer ago than I care to remember, actually, right now, where Tom proposed going down to Brazil to intact rainforest and parceling it up into pieces of different size as a way of making a prediction of what would survive in habitats that might be 1 acre, 10 acres, 100 acres, or 1,000 acres if we were to design reserves and hopefully preserve the maximum number of species there. At the time, I was thinking, this guy's not much older than me, and he's thinking about going down to Brazil and doing these massive land transformations that made a number of my research projects seem so small and so humble. But the important thing is he did it, and has achieved great notoriety for the value and impact of those results, looking forward to tropical preservation. Tonight he has a great title for us, A Wild Solution for Climate Change. I'm sure there's an innuendo there, and without further ado, Tom Lovejoy to sort it out for us.
Well, thank you, Bill. Congratulations, Jack. And thank you, Jesse Bonahue, who I met in my very first year in the Millbrook area, for being here tonight. So this is the first Ned Ames lecture. And there is Ned, in what I think of as a rather Ferdinand the Bull kind of situation. But I want to add a word to the tribute to Ned by saying he's a consummate institution builder, whether it was the transformational Ford Foundation grant to the Yale School of Forestry that turned it into a School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, or what he has achieved here at the Carey Institute. achievement, and we all know that he never stops, so we have more to look forward to. So what I want to talk to you tonight about is the issue of climate change and the world of nature. Tell you a little bit about the way of looking at climate change that helps you think about that, and then I'm going to get into what kinds of signals we're already seeing from nature, what it might look like looking ahead and some of the complications, and most importantly, what might be done to address that just really very large challenge. So in 1896, this Swedish chemist addressed a really important question, and the question was, why is the Earth a habitable temperature for humans and other forms of life? I mean, why is it a habitable temperature? And the answer was greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect. And he even went on to calculate what doubling natural levels might do to the global climate. But what he could not have known about at that time was the actual history of the global climate in the previous couple 100,000 years, which, as you can see, was highly variable and includes glacial and interglacial swings, but also includes this last 10,000 years of unusual stability in the planet's climate. And in that 10,000 years, of course, it's all recorded human history, a good chunk of unrecorded human history, the origins of agriculture, the origin of human settlements, basically makes the point that the entire human enterprise has been built on the assumption of a stable climate. And in that same 10,000 years, all ecosystems have been adjusting to a stable climate. And of course, we are continuing to build up the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The Earth's climate system is responding. We're currently 3/4 of a degree warmer on average than in pre-industrial times. And we are continuing to put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at a rate more or less along the lines of the worst case scenario of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So how is the natural world responding to what has already taken place? Well, a fair chunk of it is around the solid and liquid phases of water, and most dramatically the ice in the Arctic Ocean. And this is the annual retreat and advance of the sea ice in the Arctic Ocean through 2007, which you'll see has been progressing quite dramatically. So the date at which we might have a moment of ice-free Arctic Ocean has been advanced from 2100 to 2050 and now to dates closer to that. And of course, in most places in the northern hemisphere, lakes are freezing later in the autumn. The ice is breaking up earlier in the fall. Glaciers are in retreat in most parts of the world, so Glacier National Park will soon be that only in name. And in the tropics, where there are glaciers on very high peaks like Kilimanjaro, all tropical glaciers are receding at a rate that they will be gone within 20 years. Sea level, of course, is rising, originally just because as water is warmer, it expands, but more recently with the addition of glacial melt from ice on the land, such as in Greenland. And we're seeing places like the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge on the eastern shore of Maryland, where a scientific literature of more intense tropical cyclones. There is the larger prediction of more intense weather events, which certainly seems to be happening all over the world. And there is no debate at all about the increase of wildfire in the western United States through warmer, drier summers and earlier snow melts. I mean, we read about these fires, in fact, in the media. It is a fact of life and something that is inexorably increasing. But it's the biology that I want to spend the rest of our time on. And what we're finding, first of all, is changing in the timing of life histories of species. So lilacs are blooming earlier in New England. A whole series of plant species are blooming earlier at the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew. And it's not just plants that are changing their timing. Animals are changing their timing. So tree swallows, for example, are migrating earlier, nesting earlier, laying eggs earlier. And we're seeing species changing where they occur, beginning to track the changing climate and their required conditions. So the Aedes checker spot is one of the two best studied species of butterflies in North America, and there's absolutely no question that it is changing its geographical range, moving northward and upward in altitude. And the National Arbor Day Foundation, which one could hardly characterize as some wild-eyed terrorist environmental organization, but just about people who love to plant trees. The foundation found it necessary to publish a new hardiness zone map to guide people in successful planting of trees where they happen to live. There are a whole series of human health risks that are involved with global warming, and that is not the subject of what I want to get into tonight, but this is really a placeholder to make the point that there are going to be health risks for domestic plants, domestic animals, wild plants, and wild animals on top of all the rest. And this completely incomprehensible slide is here on purpose to make the point that what I've just been describing to you is no longer a matter of individual examples or anecdotes, as a scientist would say disparagingly. This is now statistically robust. Nature is on the move almost anywhere one looks in the world. So it's not just on the land, it's also in the oceans. So marine species, plankton species, fish species are changing where they occur. In the Chesapeake Bay, the very important eelgrass communities, highly productive communities from which the blue crabs, amongst others, are harvested. It turns out eelgrass has a very strict upper temperature limit. So the southern boundary of eelgrass in the Chesapeake Bay has been moving inexorably northward year after year. And it's not just a matter of the polar regions or the boreal forests or the temperate forests. We are even seeing impacts in the tropics. And so here in the legendary cloud forest of Monteverde, what we are seeing, documenting, is not so much a matter of temperature change, but a change relating to moisture, in this case the altitude at which clouds form. So Monteverde is experiencing an increasing number of dry days, an extremely serious trend for an ecosystem which depends primarily on condensation from clouds as its source of moisture. In the oceans, the tropical coral reefs, the equivalent in a sense of the tropical rainforest and tropical cloud forests, all looked like this when I was in graduate school. diving in the Caribbean in the 50s. Wonderfully diverse and productive ecosystems, incredibly important for a segment of the world's population because 5% of humanity lives within 100 meters of a coral reef. Starting in 1983, we began to see the impacts of elevated temperature, which essentially goes right at the heart of what a tropical coral reef system is all about. It goes right at the fundamental partnership between the coral animal and an alga, which drives the whole system. And with elevated temperature for some length of time, what happens is the coral animal ejects the alga, and the marvelous technicolor world goes black and white. The diversity crashes, the productivity crashes, the economic value crashes. And of course, there are dramatic changes for all those species whose natural history relates to ice, and the polar bear, of course, is sort of the poster child for that. But I will return in a little bit to ice-related natural history. So the big issue here is not so much what we're seeing so far. They are minor ripples in the fabric of nature, ripples that have not been observed ever in natural history documentation. The real question is, what does it look like looking ahead? And so if one looks ahead, and none of what I'm telling you is necessarily all going to happen, it's looking ahead if we continue to raise the temperature of the Earth by continuing to raise the concentration of greenhouse gases, it could be pretty dramatic. And so the first paper to try and make an estimation was this one in January 2004, and it projected that if you double greenhouse gas levels over natural in the atmosphere, that you would lose something like 20 to 30% of all species on the planet. And of course, what will be going on is a continuation of global warming, more towards the North Pole than the equatorial regions, more in the northern polar region than the southern, because there's more land in the northern hemisphere. But it's not just about temperature. It's also about moisture. And you stop for a second and think about it simplistically, but really getting at the heart of things. The two most important physical parameters for any terrestrial organism is temperature and moisture. The two most important for an aquatic organism are temperature and pH, or acidity and versus alkalinity. So there will be precipitation change. In fact, we're seeing that already. We're seeing a drying trend in the prairie pothole region of the American Middle West, a great underpinning of the central North American flyway. We're also beginning to see what are called decoupling events, where two features in nature which have been tightly coupled turn out to have one of them driven by length of day, changing length of day, and the other by changing temperature. And suddenly those tight organizations are coming apart. And so we are now actually recording moments in which the snowshoe hare and brilliant white winter pelage can be found in environments without the least bit of white snow, as on the right. And here is another example up in the Arctic. A seabird, the black guillemot, nests on land, flies to the edge of the sea ice because that's where the Arctic cod hang out, feeds there and brings the fish back to its nestlings. And what's been happening is every year there's been a greater distance to fly from the shore in this nesting colony to the edge of the sea ice. exist. We can look at what happens to particular species. This is a favorite of all of ours for all kinds of reasons. This is its current distribution in the northeastern United States. And I'm about to show you what all 5 major computer models suggest will be the distribution with the temperatures coming from double pre-industrial levels of CO2. Basically, if you enjoy autumn foliage, maple sugar, maple syrup, you're going to have to go to Canada. We're going to see changes in freshwater systems, so particularly with cold water species like trout. This, by the way, really caught the attention of Senator John Warner from Virginia. So now he's going to have to do his fly fishing in different places. And we're going to see certain classes of animals and plants in trouble before others. And that will include those that live in high places, like this marvelous little relative of the rabbits, the American pika from the Rockies, lives in a series of colonies on high mountain peaks. And basically, these high mountain species will be moving upward, tracking their climatic conditions until eventually there is no further up to go. So in Australia, in the rainforest of Queensland, there are a whole series of mammal and bird species that occur only there, and this will be a projection of what will happen to those with increasing climate change, and eventually none of them will survive if we allow that to happen. Coastal species obviously will have major problems to deal with in terms of sea level rise. It will have impacts, as I learned this afternoon, on Hudson River levels all the way up to Troy. Raises a whole series of interesting challenges as to how to manage the Hudson Valley. Could be a really exciting thing for the Carey Institute to have some kind of summit about. And island species will be in particular trouble. One, because the climate of the species on the island will actually no longer occur there. And for low-lying species, there will be the additional problem of sea level rise. So high-altitude species and island species will be among the first as classes of species to be in trouble. And as coral bleaching becomes more frequent, it will become more and more difficult for the coral reef systems to recover from bleaching events, and it gets really difficult to have a sanguine view of the future of tropical coral reefs. In addition to what I've just been describing, there are a series of complications. And these kind of complications mostly arise if we allow considerably more climate changes. These are exponential curves, so the further along that we travel, the harder it is to cope. Now, the first of these complications actually is not about that. It's about what we have done to the landscape. And basically, wherever you look in the world, the history of the use of landscape produces some pattern like this one in this county in Wisconsin, from continuous natural habitat through time to a series of isolated fragments. And what that means is as a plant or animal species tries to track its required conditions, it's basically encountering an obstacle course. As Michael Robinson, the former director of the National Zoo, once said, well, the species would move, but Philadelphia will be in the way. And this is a serious challenge, but it's also one that's easy to address by a policy to put natural connections back in the landscape. This next one is not so easy to address, and that is that we know that in the past there was climate change and a lot of biodiversity made it through. Glaciers came and went. But what was not particularly apparent until you began to study it in detail, is that it's actually not the biological community that moves. It's the individual species that move, each in its own direction and at its own speed. So what ultimately happens if you get that much climate change is that the individual species move in their own directions and rates, and the ecosystems we know disassemble, and only the surviving species assemble into new configurations, which are hard to predict. So here you're looking at 3 species of mammals and 2 species of trees, 1 insect species after the retreat of the last glacier in Europe, and it's quite apparent that there is no common pattern. So it gets messy the more climate change we have to cope with. We also know that change will not be linear or gradual, even though that's the way our computer models are built. We know that the climate system can have abrupt changes, whether it's dealing with the global conveyor belt, which distributes heat around the world's oceans, or we're looking at something like the coniferous forests in western North America, where basically a warmer climate with milder winters and longer summers has tipped the balance in favor of the native pine bark beetles. So we are looking here at British Columbia for about a 40-year period, and at the very beginning you might even have trouble finding the little red specks representing the pine beetle outbreaks, but as time goes on and more survive the milder winter and the summer is longer, and so ultimately you can get in another generation of beetles. The beetles get the upper hand, and even in 1985, when it's a really cold winter, more survived and they bounce back quickly. So almost anywhere you go in western North America these days, from Colorado to southern Alaska, there are places where on the order of 70% of all the trees are dead. It is a massive forest management problem. It's a massive fire management problem. It's hard to predict the future of those particular forests. On top of all this, we have what I tend to categorize as system change. And one of the more interesting of these involves my favorite place, the Amazon basin, and it's all about moisture. And so this marvelous movie, which we could actually spend the whole remainder looking at, hour by hour for a whole year, but I won't do that, shows how moisture is generated and moves around the world. And you see that most of it is generated over the oceans and over the equators, with the exception of the Amazon. So the moisture comes off the tropical Atlantic, enters the Amazon basin, and in a wonderful hydrological cycle is recycled as it goes across the basin. And so literally the Amazon produces half of its own rainfall. Well, in 2005, that system broke down, probably in a preview of what climate change could bring. And more recently, a World Bank study that I chaired the science for looked at the impacts of existing climate change plus deforestation and fire, which is what, of course, the forest experiences itself, and projected that Amazon dieback could occur at only 20% of deforestation. And it's currently at 18%, so it's really close to a tipping point. Well, the good news here is for something like that, you can actually do really ambitious reforestation in the reforested areas and build back the margin of safety. But these are the kinds of system change that we're beginning to flirt with in the way the world interacts between biology and the climate. And the largest of these system changes, which many of you may have already heard about by now, is that the oceans have become more acid. All that CO2 we've been adding to the atmosphere and actually feeling a sightus, some relief about the fact that most of it was being absorbed by the oceans, some of that has been turning into carbonic acid. So the oceans today are a tenth of a pH unit more acid. And that sounds really trivial, but that is one of those exponential scales. That's literally 30% more acid. So why would that be a matter of concern beyond the notion that we actually have the ability to change the basic chemistry of the oceans, do something on such a big scale? It's all the tens of thousands of species that build skeletons or shells out of calcium carbonate. And that depends on an equilibrium. And the colder it is and the more acid it is, the harder it is to mobilize calcium carbonate and make a shell or a skeleton. And some of the species so affected are well known, like the giant clam. Most people don't know about, and they're tiny little organisms at the base of food chains. And this is one of the more marvelous ones. It's a pteropod, a tiny little snail with its foot modified so they act as essentially wings to keep it up in the water column. And that's really important at the base of food chains in the northern oceans. And we're already seeing effects at the base of the food chain in the North Atlantic and off Alaska. So, looking ahead to what acidification might mean for coral reefs, aside from the temperature effects I told you, keep an eye at that little graph at the top. And as long as it's in the blue or green range, that's probably pretty reasonable for corals to mobilize calcium carbonate and build reefs. But as you increase it, and this is about where we are today, you begin to move out of that zone. If we went to 2 degrees, which is the concentration represented here, and which was concentration being discussed in Copenhagen, you're already halfway out of the good range. If you essentially doubled industrial levels, you're way beyond the favorable range for coral reefs. So we're really beginning to play at very large-scale change in the planet because of the climate change. We're beginning to see thawing in the tundra regions, and we're beginning to play around with things we know exist but don't know a lot about how they work, namely the critical thresholds in the Earth system. Clearly, it does not make a lot of sense to go there. So this is a graph from the last report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Whole series of effects at different temperature increases on the right, and the big issue in front of society is how far up that do we want to travel. So I would argue, from what we know about ice, but especially from what we know about ecosystems, that 2 degrees is too much. The 450 parts per million that equates to is too much. We're seeing ecosystem failure in the coral reefs and the coniferous forest of western North America at only 3/4 of a degree. So I would argue, along with Jim Hansen, but particularly because of the biology of the planet, that we shouldn't go beyond 350 parts per million. Many of you will know that we're already beyond that. We're at 390. So that begins to raise some interesting questions about how we manage the global environment. So I've laid out the challenges. They're pretty tough. And here is Dr. Planet. three categories here. One is, how can we make it easier for biodiversity and ecosystems to adapt to climate change? Two, what can we do about limiting the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations? And three, is there a way to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere? So in terms of adapting to climate change, one of the no-brainers we've already touched before is putting connections back into the environment, making it easier for species to move and seek their required conditions. Another no-brainer is minimize the other stresses, so we try and avoid negative synergies with climate change. And I would make the point that the existing protected areas take on a new and different role. They haven't lost general validity, they just have a new and different role. And they are the safe havens from which species can move to their new required conditions in other places. So basically, they haven't lost value, and what we really need is more conservation and not less. There's a huge energy agenda, which I won't go into tonight, but it's very clear to all of us that whatever we do, if we don't address the energy base of modern society quickly and strongly, it's going to be very, very messy indeed. So one thing you can do, actually, is limit the amount of greenhouse gases released to the atmosphere from the destruction of living ecosystems, and particularly tropical deforestation. So maybe 17% of the number gets argued about a bit, but it's a significant fraction of annual emissions actually comes from tropical deforestation and the burning of former tropical forests. If you could get that under control, you'd slow the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is the basic equation that we have to deal with in trying to manage our planet more sanely. Deal with the sources on the left, 1.5 billion tons of carbon going into the atmosphere from principally tropical deforestation, but other kinds of ecosystem transformation. A huge amount that comes from the burning of fossil fuels, as I like to say, old tropical forests. And half of it goes in the atmosphere, and the other half is mostly divided between the oceans and the land in terms of absorption. So we need to look at that equation, see whether there are ways we can adjust those ratios and maybe even change the direction of one of the arrows. And it's a big challenge, of course, because greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time, 100 to 1,000 years. So as we think about what are the ways we might pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, there's one thing that hits you right in the face very quickly, and that is biology. So twice in the history of life on Earth, there have been screamingly high CO2 levels produced by geological processes, and twice those have been brought down to levels akin to pre-industrial levels. And the first time was the emergence of plants on land, and actually sort of a biodiverse symphony of green plants and mycorrhizal fungi, providing them with nutrition and the other microorganisms in the soil and the formation of soil, successfully bringing down the CO2 level. The second time that happened was with the spread of modern flowering plants, essentially doing the same thing more efficiently. So you see there's a tremendous amount of power in biology over a long period of time. So the question is, what can you do with that power over a shorter period of time? Something more relevant to us. And if you begin to look at the numbers, you see that a couple 100 billion tons of carbon have gone into the atmosphere from destruction and modification of terrestrial ecosystems in the last 2 or 3 centuries. And so what I would suggest as an ambitious but hugely important thing to do to address this global challenge. So we should start thinking at a global scale of using ecosystems to begin to affect those greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere. This is a simple-minded conceptual graph. The only real numbers on it are those on the left. At the bottom one, 280 parts per million, was the pre-industrial level of CO2. 350 is the putative safe level. 390 is where we are. If we get the provisions about deforestation going under the Climate Change Convention, which goes under a complicated acronym, REDD, the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would go up more slowly. But beyond that, and perhaps overstated in this graph, I think we could manage the ecosystems of the planet by massive and ambitious restoration programs to pull maybe 40 parts per million out of the atmosphere over the next 50 years. And that's the difference between the 390 where we are now and the so-called safe 350. It would have the additional advantage of making all those systems more resilient in the face of the climate change they're going to have to deal with. So there's a major role here for forests, increasing the area of forests, for how we manage forests, and doing it in a way that's respectful not only of the carbon value, but of the biological diversity in these forests. There's a surprisingly significant role here for grasslands and restoring degraded grazing lands. The Australians alone think they might be able to do 40 parts per million over 50 years just by restoring their degraded grazing lands. And of course there are ways to manage agriculture to begin to return soil's carbon stocks to previous levels. So what I'm suggesting here is that it's finally time for those of us concerned about all these things to think on the right scale, on the scale of the entire planet, to recognize that the planet works not as a physical system, but as a coupled biological and physical system, and that if we set out to regreen the emerald planet, we can use the living planet to make the planet more habitable. Thank you very much.
Thomas graciously agreed to take a few questions here from the audience. If you could raise your hand.
Yes.
So, I mean, it sounds great, but how would you go about doing something? Water day every day, or?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is that some of this is already beginning to happen. So I took that funny graph to a briefing of the Natural Resources Transition Team a year ago, this past January. And within weeks, the 30% of this nation, which is managed by the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture, has begun to manage with those kinds of goals. And it sounds, you know, like I finally flipped my lid, right? But it makes so much sense when you significant progress in this direction. Yes, sir.
These concerns and issues are fine for people that are educated and are science-oriented. How do you deal with people that is beyond their consideration? And how do you deal with people who ideologically are opposed to the science and the whole concept that is having an impact on the environment?
So there are two answers to that, or maybe three. And the third of which there's some you're never going to be able to get to anyway. But there are programs in place already on an experimental basis in the Brazilian Amazon, state of Amazonas, which basically provide incentives to the communities that are working in the right direction. And the communities respond.
Like the Rainforest Alliance.
Well, I'm thinking about the government of the state of Amazonas, which is 2.3 times the size of Texas. It is the largest political unit in South America other than a country. And they started a program called essentially Forest Grants, which rewards communities that are seeking, their aspirations in ways that don't destroy the forest. And interestingly enough, the actual grants to the individual families, the voucher goes to the mother of the family. And most of the microfinance exercises in the world all operate that way. In this case, it makes extra sense because I like to say they don't call her Mother Nature for nothing. So one answer is incentives. For people who don't even necessarily understand that it's part of this larger picture. And then, we have a farm bill in this country which provides a financial reward to farmers. And in many senses, farmers aren't going to fuss over what the reward is for as long as there's a reward. And in fact, if you do manage, agricultural land to build up the soil, you get better agriculture in the end. You improve degraded grazing land, you get better grazing. So I think there's a real probability here of getting some traction. And the third answer to your question is there's some people who they will never get it, and they'll probably be outside the system until they see somebody gaining from it, and then they'll want to be part of it. Yes?
How much danger do you feel like is program of reforestation on properly implemented? Notice the red program in planting certain kinds of forests that let the unforeseen consequence of is potentially reducing biodiversity rather than increasing it.
Well, you raise a very important point. You need to set up the incentives for this so that it's not just about carbon. So that there's a greater incentive for doing natural forest restoration. And in a sense, the important thing here is not to value a forest only for its carbon, which would be like valuing a computer chip only for its silicon. So you just have to proactively think about it in that way and sort of avoid going down the road of what I like to call a giant asparagus patch.
There's one more.
Yes.
Do you think that the current science building Congress has enough of a position for that, or do they not go far enough?
The answer to that is no. The House bill is pretty good. The Senate bill that was supposed to have been put out this week wasn't going to have anything. So we'll just see what happens. But we, as a country, we made a pledge at Copenhagen to put out the first $1 billion towards this. So if it's not in the first climate bill, there will be a need to honor that pledge.
Thank you.